Play. My name is Robert Mardlacci of Mindshare Learning, CEO and founder, and I'm honored to be a member of Mario's, Dr. Jason's organizing team and introducing today's session, sponsored by Steelcase. A fascinating topic, shifting to remote and online learning. The abstract reads, we are living in an unprecedented time. Schools are closed around the world, causing educators and students to adjust to new realities of teaching and learning online. Our guest speakers from Steelcase will speak to what they have been learning about this shift to remote and online learning, what it might mean for the near and further futures of education, and share some of the ideas schools might consider as they redesign their learning spaces in a post-COVID environment. I'm honored to introduce Aileen Strickland. McGee is a senior design researcher, passionate about the ways in which the built environment shapes our experiences. As a member of the Workspace Futures team, a very cool title, Steelcase, Aileen is part of the team that dives into deeply understanding the ways that people live, work, and learn. By asking big questions and exploring complex answers, the team helps Steelcase envision possibilities and frame real-world choices for the present and future of living, working, and learning. For the past 10 years, Aileen has been focused on exploring these complex answers within the field of education and educational learning environments. And I pass the baton over to you, Aileen. Thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for tuning in. So I'm going to share my screen. So if there is some issue with seeing it, please let me know. So today we're going to talk about navigating what's next. Learning spaces, and I would say not even a post-COVID, but just a COVID environment as well. And can you all see my slide switch okay? Okay.
Yes, can see that there. Go ahead.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, great. And because we're real-time working from home, you may hear some pitter-patter of small feet, so I apologize for any of that. So we at Steelcase just put out a resource. So some of the information that we're going to share today is new and it's not necessarily in here, some of the research up front, but a lot of the design ideas and principles that we'll share, you can go to this resource and dig in a lot deeper. So just know that this is available if you're interested to learn more and just get more ideas. And we also have done some past webinars around the topics of well-being, this big pivot to remote learning. And so those are also accessible through our website as well. So to get started, at its height, almost 1.6 billion learners in 193 countries were impacted by COVID, which is basically the entire world, which is a tremendous number when you think about it. And so today what we want to share with you is first, we want to share a little bit from a research perspective, what we've learned about the transition to and the experience of remote learning through a project we did basically at the end of April and into May. And then talk about some longer term implications as well as some near term impacts for education. And then last, we want to share with you just some spatial applications and ideas. So starting to put some of what we've learned into some concrete form. And then we will, of course, leave time for any questions and answers that you might have. So the first section that we would like to share with you today is all around transition to an experience of remote learning and teaching. And so back when this all started, just a few short months ago, and as more and more schools were shifting to remote and online ways of learning, we really wanted to understand that experience for students and teachers, what that transition was like and what the experience has been for them over March and April and into May. And so we are a very user-based and human-centered led company. And so we always start with trying to understand our users. And so that's where this small and fast research project came out of. So we're just going to share with you some of what we learned. And so to collect some of this data, we used a variety of different methods. We used D-Scout missions, and if you're not familiar with D-Scout missions, it is basically a platform, and it's something that you can access through your mobile device, where you are able to set up large questions or perhaps diary missions and engage participants from really across the globe. We kept ours into North America for this particular one, and it reaches a lot of different students and teachers. For us was the main population. So we set up a couple missions to understand some of those experiences, and they could submit videos and photos and answer questions more in depth in a quick and easy way. We also did a survey with almost 60 teachers and educators. We conducted interviews, as well as doing extensive secondary research and reading everything that we could, because there was a lot out there. So I'll share 5 insights that we learned, and each one has some sub points. And so the first one was that the preparedness of schools really set the stage for remote learning and teaching experiences. And we saw that there was a range of experiences for students and teachers, from some people only getting a single email and saying, okay, we're remote now, figure it out, to really a bevy of communication, training, resources, and ongoing support throughout that entire experience. So it really varied quite widely. And then some of the key drivers that made key differences for the experience of teachers and students were alignment, access, the pedagogy, familiarity with the tools, and communication, which I will dive into in a little bit more detail here. So these key drivers really set the stage for experience. So we heard that, you know, when schools had alignment and clarity, even if they were figuring it out, but if there was some larger alignment and clarity about how they were going to proceed forward, and that was communicated, it really made a better remote experience for teachers and students. Equitable access. So one of the top challenges for teachers was just ensuring that all of their students had access to internet connection and the devices so that they could access the learning. And so the better that schools were able to address those issues, the less stress and challenge around that. Pedagogy, so schools or individual teachers who were already practicing more student-driven pedagogies, where students were mostly or more self-directed, they had an easier time adapting to remote learning. Then familiarity. So obviously familiarity with those digital tools really influenced adoption and full use of the tools. So you had teachers, again, who were much more familiar with the tools and platforms and had already been using them. So that made for an easier transition than those teachers who perhaps had not used them at all or to their full capacity. And then the last one, which was really important and came up in a number of different of those methods, was really all around communication. So the more transparent, meaningful, and open channels of communication between teachers, students, schools, parents for the lower grades was really, really important. And so, you know, we set this here too to think about, as schools look towards this fall, what are some of those key things that can help make those experiences better as they think about what might be coming for the fall. The second insight that came out of this was that teacher and student well-being is a critical priority. And so teachers and students predominantly felt like this transition and experience was challenging and overwhelming, probably not groundbreaking. It probably sounds familiar. But that when teachers showed adaptability, accessibility, and empathy, both the student and teacher experience was positively impacted. And so we see one of the methods we used was asking them to use one word to describe the experience. And you can see that the words highlighted in the pink-red color were more of a negative sentiment, whereas the blue was slightly more positive sentiment, and the yellow being more neutral. And so you can see that obviously the biggest words were the biggest responses. So most people said those around difficult, challenging, frustrating, overwhelming, distracting, stressful, with other in there. So you can see that these words really sort of stand out. And then just a quote from a student from higher ed that this is especially difficult for me, seeing as I didn't have a home to go back to at first. So it's extremely difficult to worry about passing a class when you are worried about where you're going to lay your head at night. So we heard things like that, well, which we'll touch on in a little while when we look at the larger impact of this on education. Teachers saying the same things. I mean, it's just almost the same words: difficult, challenging, frustrating for them as well. And the third insight we had was around clarity, flexibility, and effective use of the digital tools made a difference of that learning experience. So we talked about setting the stage for the driving, and this is really about during that experience. And then so the balance of structure and flexibility with communication were key elements, as well as the effective use of digital tools and platforms. So with the teacher saying the best thing that they did was sit down with their learning outcomes and decide how they could still accomplish them with an online format. So again, looking at that structure, but providing some flexibility in delivery. And then with the digital tools, what we heard, especially from students, was they wanted to have the school be standardized on one remote learning platform. So this came a lot too from higher ed, saying some teachers were, using Google Classroom, and some were using Canvas, some were using Zoom, and it was a lot for them to manage, multiple types of platforms for their learning and remember, what goes with what, or what platform that are connected to what class. They also talked about providing platform training, especially for teachers and faculty. So we heard this both from the teachers and faculty saying we need more help on how to use these, and then students recognizing that it was really frustrating when their teacher educator didn't know how to use the tools, and then they had to actually help teach the instructor how to do it. And then just maximizing the use of the digital tools. So using the back channel chats, or requiring different etiquette so that all parties have to be on video to increase participation. So sort of setting some of that stage for how to use these digital tools. Then the fourth one, we're going to bring this back to physical space, but that physical space is really more than just a space for learning. And so some of the themes that we heard here were that spaces were places of community and connection. So the number one thing we heard is that people just missed their friends, they missed their colleagues, they just missed each other, which again, not surprising, but certainly that was something that came through very strong. Spaces harness a collective energy and spontaneity that cannot be replicated. So teachers talking about, again, just being in the space with their students and being able to see what they're working on and respond in real time. It just wasn't as possible with the virtual medium, as well as students saying it just makes a difference when you're around people engaged in the same activity. Being in a different space influenced motivation. So we heard this a lot from students saying just getting up and moving to different spaces put them in a different mindset. It was a lot harder to be motivated when all you did is roll out of bed and you had to use that same space to do your schoolwork. And then the last one is around the ecosystem of learning spaces having a lot of different affordances that were just simply missing at home. So we'll dive into a couple of these here. So just a quote from a student saying that on-campus experience is so much more, a gazillion things: your job, your friends, going to campus events or doing things on campus, being with other students, trying new things. So again, the value of that campus being much broader than just delivery of content or knowledge acquisition. And teachers saying, again, I miss seeing my students, talking to them about their lives, talking to them about their achievements, their fears, seeing them graduate, showing their prom dresses. So again, all those small, personal, sort of organic, spontaneous moments that emerge when we are together, and really missing a lot of that and recognizing how important that was. And then one student putting it quite dramatically, saying, "It feels like the soul of learning has been ripped out." And so here you can see this was a collection of photographs submitted by teachers and where they were teaching. And so you can see it really varies from the kitchen counter to dedicated workstations to working on bathroom vanities to pianos to being sort of tucked away in a closet. And so in a makeshift green studio right there on the dining room table. And so again, we heard a lot of, "I miss having spaces to spread out and keep all my things," or just a comfortable chair. You can see in the middle there, somebody sitting on a little Care Bear stool to teach, which after hours of that has to be uncomfortable. So there was a lot of missing of that ergonomic and physical environment support and affordance. And then the last one to touch on here is just that a hybrid and blended learning experiences that are built on student-centered pedagogy is best for the future. So we heard a lot of, through this experience, recognizing that the virtual and remote experience does have strengths, but mixing that with face-to-face is really what students want to see more of in the future. And then also that the focus on experiences building the skills for both teachers and students. So, right now was a period where, whether you liked it or not, you had to practice adaptability, agility, resilience. And we heard teachers say, "I recognize that I've been hand-holding my students too much, and I really need to think more about how to put and empower them so they can be building these skills." Because it was clear when they switched that, for example, their students didn't have some of those necessary skills. So we heard that from both sides. So really, when we look at that virtual and face-to-face coming together, thinking about what are the strengths of those virtual or remote learning experiences and what are the strengths of the face-to-face, and how do you create learning experiences that really take the best of both. Okay, so that was this experience or research that we found when we really studied what this experience has been like over the past few months. We also did looking at, so one of the things that our group does is look into the future of how this is going to shape the future of education. And so we just want to share with you a couple points of how we see some of the longer term impacts of COVID having on education. So certainly new ways of teaching and learning. Schools are already experimenting with these right now because they were forced to. And even if schools were already on this path, that's been accelerated. And so even if remote learning isn't the full-time norm in a few years, we do know that this is really going to shift the way that people think about the learning experiences and why people are on campus and what they can do perhaps remotely. And again, what you might see of a rise of those blended or hybrid learning experiences sort of here to stay after in a truly post-COVID world. Developing the needed skills and dispositions. So as I just pointed out, as a part of our last insight, is that we've already been hearing that both from the industry side or the workplace side, that there are these skills that are needed from students around how to learn, again, resiliency, adaptability, socio-emotional skills. And I think we've seen that as students and teachers have needed to adapt quickly and be more creative in how they problem solve in the last few months, that there's more stress on developing these needed skills. And then from the workplace side, seeing that this is just an uncertain world and people have to pivot quickly. And so both students and educators need to be gaining those skills in order to thrive in a more volatile and agile world. Certainly focus on well-being. So this is something that we at Steelcase have been tracking quite closely and are engaged in some research on. And we know that the focus on well-being has been a growing concern and a growing focus within education, but certainly this moment in time has highlighted the importance of really thinking about the whole student, the whole teacher, how they are interconnected, and not just that, but the communities in which they live. And so in order to have students and educators thrive, how to start to center well-being as a more core part of an educational experience. The fourth, facing issues of inequity. So issues of inequity have been present within both the primary, secondary, and tertiary education, unfortunately, but COVID has certainly exacerbated a lot of these issues around inequity. So certainly as some students who just don't have access to devices and internet access are automatically sort of put behind, they are worried that this is going to exacerbate some of those inequities for student learning and student well-being over time. But we're also seeing that some students, and you saw that in the quote earlier, count on schools for more than just their learning, but it's the places that their parents get childcare, it's where they might get food. In higher ed, it's where they have housing and jobs. Can everybody still see my screen okay? I just had something come up on my screen that it might have gone away. I just want to make sure people can still see.
Yes, Arlene.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for confirming. And then this one around long-standing structures are stress. So this probably is not a surprise. You've read about it a lot in news outlets around the world, and certainly here in North America. But a lot of the stresses on the business models of education are really being stretched. So as students are starting to question whether they should even go back to school, and schools count on those tuition dollars, for example, is starting to already strain what was recognized as an issue, but it's really pushing it to the limit. And so you're seeing schools think more drastically about how do we make sure that we can stay afloat in a truly post-COVID world and work through this to change with the future. So we see this sort of propelling some of that as well. And then the last one I'll touch on is just emerging partnerships. And so these are really complex and interdependent problems and issues in education, like just take inequity, for example. And so this is not something that a school is going to solve completely on their own in their own silo, but really looking to see how it can be solved with new partnerships. So for example, here in the US, with some schools out on the West Coast that were unable to get broadband access, they worked with some private tech companies to help bring access to students where they perhaps did not have it, so they could connect and learn remotely. So that's just a very small example, but there are certainly more robust examples unfolding both in the US and North America and around the world to look at how do we solve some of these stickier, harder, complex problems that have been emerging in education already, but certainly exacerbated by COVID. And so these long-term implications, and we're thinking, in different ways about these, and they don't necessarily give us hard and fast answers, but they certainly cause us to ask new questions, which is sometimes just as important. So some of those questions are things like, how might we imagine blended experiences and learning tools that can easily toggle between campus and off campus? Or how might institutions accelerate their adoption on student-centered personalized learning experiences to have students and educators practice and develop these critical skills and dispositions? How might spaces on campus adapt quickly as enrollments and on-campus residency fluctuate? How might new partnerships between private and public sectors be necessary to solve some of the most pressing issues in education? And questions can go on and on. But again, those are some of these new questions that we're asking ourselves, and then also engaged in conversations with people like you to learn about how your mindsets or thoughts are shifting around these things. Okay, so now as we get closer to showing you some more, what does this mean in the now? So the last two sections were maybe giving us a larger framing or understanding of the experience, but what does this mean now going forward? And we'll focus a little bit more on the near-term future. So this is a graph that here in the US, the Chronicle of Higher Ed has been tracking what institutions of higher ed are doing when it comes to fall. So I think they started publishing this in May, and they update it every handful of days. And so this is the latest from the end of day yesterday. So I pulled the graph this morning, but you can start to see now some of the things that schools are looking at. And if you are interested in learning more about this, you can click on this link below or Google, and you can actually click on a link to each of the schools, and that brings you to their page of what they are doing. But you can see that, over half, 64% right now of the colleges they're tracking are planning for in-person classes in some capacity. 16% proposing a hybrid model, 8% online, 8% still considering a range of scenarios, and 4.5% still waiting. And so this has actually been interesting to look at over the last basically month and a half that they've been tracking this. And even between when I just pulled this graph this morning to a week and a half ago, that proposing a hybrid model jumped like 8%. So it was interesting that all of a sudden now more schools in the last even just week and a half have started to put out their plans, and it's more focused around this hybrid model as well. So some of the things that we're hearing from schools, again, these might sound familiar to you, or some of the things that your schools are discussing. These remote and hybrid models of learning, obviously. So assuming that there are students and teachers that are going to be teaching and learning from home in some capacity and not on campus full time. Certainly stepped up hygiene and health measures, everything from temperature checks to cleaning protocols to sanitation stations, just a whole bevy of new health and hygiene measures when people do come onto campus or into buildings. Smaller class sizes, and so you'll see this reflected in a lot of the ideas and applications that we'll share with you here in just a few moments. And that there's less people in these enclosed spaces and they're spaced farther apart. Which means that in order to do this, a lot of schools are then not just playing with the spaces, but they're playing with the staggered schedules or the timing. So schools extending their school days, opening early, staying open later so they can fit more smaller class sizes in, having different rotational models. So some students just coming in on some days and some on the other. So schools sort of, again, thinking about ways of doing that as well. A new academic calendar. So hearing that schools might be starting a little earlier or ending by, November. By the American Thanksgiving, and so that when flu season naturally starts to go up, that will be a time that people will already be off campus largely, so planning for that. Obviously no large events, and so this can have big implications for schools that certainly have a lot of sporting events or large events happening on their campus, conferences, things like that, not happening this year, or happening more in a virtual way for conferences, for example, like this. Certainly thinking a lot more intentionally about some of those well-being supports. So knowing that, the first and foremost coming back to campus, it's about supporting their physical safety, the stepped up health and hygiene measures and all of these other things above that they're doing, but also understanding that it's also about psychological safety, people feeling comfortable coming back. There was just a poll put out, I think a week or so ago, I think it was by USA Today, but they had like 1/5 of teachers in lower schools just saying that I'm not comfortable coming back. I'm not coming back. And 30% of parents saying that they don't feel comfortable sending their kids back. So I think understanding when people are back, how are schools supporting some of that psychological and emotional safety, certainly, and then knowing that this is a high stress, high anxiety, not just for students and educators, but for their families as well. What are the ways in which schools are helping strengthen those relationships and support one another in that? And then just using outdoor and isolation spaces. So if it's possible, I know in Canada and certainly here in the northern US that ability to use outdoor spaces is quite short as we enter the fall, but using those if possible. And then when students or educators or staff might get sick, where are those spaces that they can quickly be isolated on campus so not to infect others? Okay, so what I would like to just to share with you now, because I do want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions and answers. So over the next, 10 to 15 minutes or so, just share with you some spatial applications and some of the things that we've been thinking about. Again, we will have some of this available in that navigating what's next guide that we've already put out if you want to go deeper, but I'll just share some highlights here. I'll hopefully giving you some concrete things to think about. So some of the three big things that we've been thinking about as we consider some design considerations especially for this fall and this next year are around density, geometry, and division. So we'll just quickly go through each one of those and what we mean by those. So when we think about density as a design consideration, again, thinking about those minimum distances, that 6 feet or 2 meter distancing between people in learning and social spaces. And we'll show some examples of how we might be doing that through removing desks or tables or seating or alternating them and things like that. Meeting out in the open, so using larger open spaces for group meetings and leveraging that flexible furniture with movable whiteboards to create boundaries if there's multiple groups using a wider open area. And we see this too with schools who are like, well, we can't have, we're going to have more people in the building than allows us for minimum distance. So some schools thinking about how they can use those areas like gyms or cafeterias, or perhaps they have wider hallways, a little bit different, where they can actually start holding things there and gives people a little bit more space. And then more own spaces. So just trying to reduce and eliminate some of the shared desking and shift to more assigned spaces in some cases. And so what you'll see in a lot of what I'll share with you is some of our pre-COVID and post-COVID. So you can see, if you can't read space plans, don't worry, we'll have some nicer pictures in a moment. But basically you'll see these little circles which sort of indicate that 6 foot or 2 meter diameter around students. And so when you're looking at this floor plate, we're looking at, can a classroom start to spill out and use different spaces for that learning? So again, that takes some careful consideration by the teachers and the schools to think about those learning experiences that they might spread out over spaces. And then thinking about the circulation through those spaces and how to control circulation. So I'm sure if you've been to a grocery store or anything, they'd have little markers on where to walk, what's out, an entrance and exit, shutting off some certain entry and exit so they can really control that circulation and footpaths around those spaces more carefully, at least in the near future. The second thing that we think about is geometry. So how might we just reorient furniture to reduce that face-to-face orientation? And how might we just pull apart those desks to increase that distancing? And so you can see in some of these examples, it's actually pulling those students apart, taking out furniture, moving their orientation from facing each other to facing and staggering their desks. And perhaps adding some division. So we'll share some images like this that sort of share this better, but here is more of like a library space or perhaps a learning commons where you just see from the top to the bottom where, excuse me, some division has been put into place, some different orientation of the tables, and then just spacing them a little bit further out. So it still can support some of the similar activity, but just done in a safer way due to infection control. And then sanitation stations. So again, thinking about placing those around spaces in various ways so people have easy access and be continually reminded to just make sure that their hands are sanitized and they're not helping that spread, but they're hindering it. And then the last design consideration around division. So again, adding space division to learning spaces in different ways, creating or reusing, repurposing those movable screens, and then having a little bit more height again through that division. And so there's different ways to do that. I think people think about just like screens, which is one way, but there's a lot of different ways that could be used too. They could be hugely mobile with acoustic properties, have some biophilic elements in it, or just be desk-based. And they could also have dual purpose. So hopefully a lot of schools already have some of these things where they've got mobile whiteboards and they're actually usable surfaces, but they also act as infection control division. And here's just some of the plexiglass, which you may have seen sort of starting to emerge in post-COVID or in COVID conversations as well. There's certainly those options. So now over in the next, 7-8 minutes or so, I just want to share with you some more examples put into spaces. So here's some teaching and learning settings, and I won't go into depth into each one, but just kind of give you an example, and you can dive further in the guide. But you can see that a typical classroom, might seat 36 students. And so in the COVID or post-COVID world, it might just be less students. And so pulling some of that furniture apart, you can sort of see how more space then is created. And if you even Google images of in different countries that students have started to go back to school, you'll see something very similar to this. So here is a pre-classroom, they're sort of packed in. And then this idea that there's just less students in that space at one time, they're spaced further apart. And that's something as simple as, well, I shouldn't say simple, but it's about taking out just chairs to physically distance. Using what is in that environment. This is our verb solution, for example, just to create that division. It's also a whiteboard. Here you have still oriented toward each other, but you've taken out the chairs and there's a little bit more perhaps separation between them as well. Maybe if you're still having those group breakout modes. Here you have some freestanding screens. Again, this doesn't appeal to everybody, but there are some schools who are looking at how they might integrate some of these freestanding screens in some of their environments. Or desk-based screens or clamp-on. Again, in different modes, so still having that flexibility with different modes, but just doing it perhaps in a safer way. A flipped classroom, so you can see that as schools think more about these hybrid or blended learning experiences, they might be installing more cameras. So you can see that on that front whiteboard to record the classes for students who are either remote, to bridge the two. And again, this is just sort of a retrofit to think about how this might happen in these types of environments. So they don't all have to look like everyone's facing the same way, but you can do it in more collaborative ways, but safely. Individual desks with some separation and some screens. Perhaps a rotational model within class where students might not be doing all of the same thing at the same time, but they're rotating in terms of their stations, and there might be some cleaning protocols between rotation or space use, but keeping enough distance. So again, I'm probably showing more images just to kind of give you a flavor. I won't go into detail with each one, but I just want to make sure that you got a visual examples of all of the different possibilities that could happen in the fall. And here's actually a photo we had of a school who did start to return. They have our no chairs, so it's a highly flexible classroom in that manner. And you can see that they have just spaced those apart. And they can still wiggle and turn towards one another, but there's enough distance around them to make that possible in this particular space. So we're looking at collecting more of these as schools get into the fall. So hopefully in the fall we can share more around what we're seeing schools doing across the world. And so here's a typical large lecture hall. So again, something as simple as perhaps if you're still holding these sorts of things, pulling out some of those chairs to distance. And then this being present in K5 as well. So here again on the left is sort of pre and then in this post. So this is the same furniture, just pulling it further apart, giving people a little bit more room and taking some chairs out, putting some division in for this particular space to give students know their boundaries. Same with the group breakout, just lessening the students in those spaces. And here, perhaps controlling some of their circulation and also creating some of those divisions between groups and people. And then just quickly looking at some other areas outside of classroom. So that was fairly classroom heavy, but looking at student learning commons. So from the pre to the post. And so here, again, it's not changing drastically, but it's really playing with that physical separation and pulling things apart a little bit more. Here, another student commons, for example, and rearranging some of those furniture, lessening the people in the space, but not changing the nature or of what that space supports. And same thing here. And as you look through these, you'll see that, a lot of schools, I think, are thinking about, well, when we have to separate, it's like taking chairs out, it's looking sparse, marking things off with big X's, but knowing that you can do this in more creative ways. So here is one where they're actually using biophilia elements as division, but thinking about, that those spaces between chairs don't necessarily have to be marked with an X to don't sit here, but maybe there's more creative ways to mark off some of those spaces, like biophilic elements, but also perhaps questions to provoke curiosity, different objects, have the students create something to fill those spaces. Students are hugely creative, especially younger students, to help fill those spaces in. So it doesn't seem like something's been taken away, but just that it's shifted. So here's a student lounge space where we might have, 3 Brodies in the back. We've just taken one out and replaced that, for example, put a little bit more division up. For a media center, so again, you'll see just pulling things out a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more spatial division on the desks. And then these cafe social learning spaces. So these being still important, but again, not packing people in. We're doing this actually at Steelcase in our learning and innovation centers and business centers as well, is using these large open spaces for meetings because there is more room to spread out, but we're not packing people in. So this is sort of the example happening within, or could be happening within education. And then the last spaces I'll just share with you are staff spaces. And so here with meeting rooms, again, just taking out some of those chairs. So a meeting room meant for 20 might be half that now. So just some examples of that. Putting tables in to divide up so they feel like more individual spaces than shared group spaces. So you can sort of see the difference between left and the right. Same thing here, the pods perhaps in the back, if there's more, thinking about, as staff or faculty are starting to need to perhaps record their lectures more and they're not doing that from home, if there's a space on campus that can be dedicated to things like that as well, more need for those spaces. So here's another example of that, perhaps a different type of recording studio, faculty office. And then this being a very nice teach from home. So not like some of the photos that we've received in our research project, but how to create those small little micro areas within somebody's home, perhaps a corner of their house. You know, putting the backdrop, a usable backdrop with a whiteboard with, you know, just the camera. So kind of low tech solutions, but ones that perhaps create at least a little space for them to do it, so they're not just doing it on their dining room table or kitchen counter. So again, I know that we went through a lot today from a research and sharing a lot of different ideas for applications. So please know that, again, this resource is available for you to download, to look at, and then certainly those past webinars that I mentioned for more information, both around this as well as some other topics like well-being, for example, that we are looking much deeper into. So I would, love to shoot it back and open it up if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Aileen, for that insightful presentation. And I see we do have a question from William Duncan. Could this mean that schools long-term start moving towards a more satellite model, fewer big school buildings that need to be heated or cooled, and more learning spaces spread throughout the community?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. And that is certainly something that what we've been seeing of where this leads, thinking about that, those spaces definitely becoming more distributed, both perhaps across campus, but even falling outside of campus. And when you think about how we've also seen a shift to these more student-centered, personalized paths. And now we see even more students questioning, do I have to go to this institution, or is there a way to sort of build this experience more myself that will be relevant to what I want to study or what I want to learn and will help me get a job? I think when you see some of those forces, they're all pushing in that same direction around just that perhaps in the future that these will be more dispersed. And does that mean that a campus sort of falls across a community, or does it mean that there might be, again, these new emerging partnerships, not just between public and private, but also between institutions to help create some of that? And when they think about their real estate or facilities, do they all have to own their spaces, or can they start to create these shared spaces in more amongst the community? So I think you're right on that we might be seeing more of that, and this is certainly a shift in that direction.
Aileen, I have a question for you. This is Robert Mardacci once again, and you've provided great inspiration for us as we prepare to open up our co-working space tomorrow. So from a distancing perspective and furniture layout and reconfiguration, you gave me some great ideas. How important, given COVID and the impact on social emotional learning on kids, how important is color in the furniture equation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as my background is also in interior design as well, and I'm a color aficionado, I think we do know that color can tremendously impact the ways that we experience and read spaces. And I think that's where what I touched on a little bit earlier is when people think of infection control and making sure that things are more sterile, perhaps that recalls like this very austere, clean surface, sort of white, sort of hospital-like environment, when really it doesn't necessarily have to look like that. There can be creative ways. Color doesn't indicate cleanliness. So I think thinking about how to make these spaces feel alive And that's where, again, I think these elements of biophilia, and that's not just through things like plants, which are great no matter what, but it is about, again, using color, thinking about ways to integrate art and creativity into these spaces as an important part. Because I think that, as you mentioned, you know, coming back into these spaces and they start to look different, it sort of, I mean, it does. I certainly know that I feel that way when I look at pictures of our workplace. It looks different. It looks more spread out. It doesn't feel warm and fuzzy. But I think that's where, if a school can start to think more creatively about how do we not make sure that these spaces feel sparse and open, but rather fill some of those like distancing spaces that we need, but do that in a more creative way that feels more inviting. I think there's a lot of possibility that people could come up with really creative ideas and actually engage students and teachers in that process, so they feel like they have some control over their spaces, and it's not just, now I just have to deal with this, but there's actually something that they still can do, and creativity still lives in those spaces, even if they have to perhaps think of new parameters or new aspects that they didn't have to around infection control before.
That's brilliant to make the kids feel part of it. And one of the comments from Jane Wilson: natural colors are more calming, not bright, allow students to create with you. And then I like the notion of bringing nature in. And one of the schools we hosted our at Tech Summit in last year in Vancouver area, a lot of glass, a lot of natural wood, garage doors that open outdoors. So I think with design planning, the future design thinking in schools is going to be transformation. This COVID learning period, as I call it, will make it a transformational marker for us, no doubt.
Right.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing any. With that, thank you so much, Eileen, for your insight and passion. The research that Steelcase has done is seminal and very important. We will be including the report that Barry, your colleague, Barry, shared with me in our Mindshare Learning Report top 10. Barry Brennan in the coming days. So it's going to be shared across the country, and it's super valuable. And I'm going to turn the baton over to Dr. Mario Chason to say a few words, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you so much there, Robert, for doing that. This is great. Thank you, Dr. Strickland. This is very insightful and very informative. As a general comment, like, we're talking about, a digital world amplifying, with the last room was, but on the other side, there's also the digital space, but also the physical space. And there's a strong relationship in both of them. I think that you nailed it right on the head about the well-being, in the context of this. We know that the last, 2 months has been very stressful for teachers to assisting in guiding the learning from home and all that, and how have they adjust and adopt, learning space, like you're saying. So, as a general component, we're privileged that the Atlantic Education Summit Steelcase as a strong partner in providing some, resources, but also there's some insightful results in all the work that you've been dealing with us. It's help us, as a building, when you talk about building knowledge, building capacities, and building communities, you're definitely one of those elements that allow us to build knowledge and building, some capacities and how that we can craft and adopt this learning space. That because, yes, home is great, but the social context is so much important. And and it is a fundamental thing. And, the work that we have done, we know that the number one thing is human being relationship. So thank you for doing that. And we're definitely going to, to expand and amplify your work into our work, from a leadership perspective, and how that we can take advantage of that. So thank you so much again to take your valuable time into this. And thank you as well for Barry, Brennan, and Joel, to tackle you, and to steal you for an hour for that. So, it's a privilege. It's an honor to have you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, right on. Okay.
Thanks. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.